Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think that we're live. I hope so. Anyway, good afternoon to those of you in Europe. Good morning if you're joining us from the US or North America or anywhere actually on the western side of things. My name is Louise Norton-Smith, and I'm going to be moderating today this session, which is sponsored by the UK government. I head up the global AMR strategy team, which is situated in the Department of Health and Social Care in London, and our focus spans R&D investments for products designed to address the AMR threat in low middle income countries. That's through our global AMR Innovation Fund, or GAMRIF. We also focus on increasing AMR and AMU surveillance capacity and capability in LMICs through the £265 million Fleming Fund. And then we also do work on really driving policy change and maintaining political momentum globally, and that's through our AMR diplomacy work. So the activities that we do are really truly cross-governmental, and we have investments and activities being led by UK ministries, agencies, and indeed the diplomatic missions around the world. And it's thanks to our friends in the Department of Health, for International Trade, the UK Science and Innovation Network, the British Embassy in Bern, and the UK Mission in Geneva. I hope I've got everybody right. That today's session is actually free, available to everybody, even those who aren't registered for the conference. So big thank you to them. And we're going to be covering a new initiative on investor action on AMR, and that's being led by a number of partners you'll hear from today. But before we do, I have the pleasure of introducing the godmother of action on AMR, Professor Dame Sally Davies. And Dame Sally is the UK government's special envoy on AMR, has been since 2019. And she's also the 40th Master of Trinity College in Cambridge, the first woman to hold this post in the college's 474-year history. Before that, Dame Sally was the Chief Medical Officer for England and the Chief Medical Advisor in the UK government from 2011 to 2019, where many of you will know her from that time, where she became a very serious campaigner on AMR. She's become a real leading figure in both this and wider global health issues, serving on the WHO Executive Board, and also was co-convener of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on AMR, which reported last year. Dame Sally is going to talk to you today on why investors need to care about AMR and the global need for an AMR lens, as well as the UK government's role on the investor action on the initiative. So Sally, over to you, I hope.
Thank you, Louise. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you today from a bit of Europe and speak to you about a topic that I'm deeply passionate about, antimicrobial resistance, and why we TB and viruses. But before starting, I want to congratulate Biocom on organising this great virtual conference over the course of the week. It's not easy to pull off something like this successfully, given where we are at the moment. So well done, and thank you for keeping AMR on the agenda. After all, it's likely that all of us today here know that antibiotics underpin modern medicine. We also know that antibiotic research and development form the foundations of green industry, biosecurity, and sustainable supply chains. It is awful that there are people dying of lack of access to antibiotics across the world. And I'm sure others will pick that up. But also, in the rich world, we get stockouts too. So this is something we have to address. But it's also imperative that across the world, everyone understands that AMR is a macroeconomic issue. The O'Neill review, commissioned by our Prime Minister on AMR, estimated the total cost of AMR to the global economy to be over 100 trillion US dollars, or 80 trillion in UK money, by 2050. I remember people laughing at us when he came out with these figures, which he thought were conservative. Look where we are now with our economies and the impact of a pandemic. As I'll come back to it, this is the pandemic that's slowly growing. But to put these figures in perspective, this is roughly the equivalent of losing our entire UK economy from the global economic output each and every year. A terrifying statistic, particularly for us in Britain, but I know everyone will agree. And the World Bank's shown that AMR could cause a global economic contraction of up to 3.8% by 2050, an equally staggering figure, and that it will impact the low-income countries more than the rich countries. This is just not fair. They're the figures of the future, but they're the facts. And those figures are consequent on the decisions that have been made, are being made, and will be made every day around the world. And so it can go up or it can come down, depending on the choices that consumers, businesses, and governments make about sustainability. And sustainability is a key word. After all, we're only a decade away from the 2030 SDGs. Do you think we're going to reach them? Has COVID stopped it? Or is it that COVID's going to be the excuse for not delivering on what we should? We believe that to meet them, we've got to accelerate sustainable solutions to the world's biggest challenges. So you've got to have dependable antimicrobials. There really is no time to wait. We've got to secure the future from drug-resistant infections. And of course, No Time to Wait was the title of the UN Secretary General's 2019 report, which I encourage all of you to reread and refresh your memories of, which we look forward to taking those recommendations set out in the report up and making them happen over coming months and years. Principally, we have to recognize that AMR is driven by a really complex ecosystem of humans, animals, plants, food, and the environment. So to respond, we need everyone. We need all stakeholders across the whole world and across all sectors. At present, farming and food production contributes to the spread of AMR and undermines not only our ability to treat animal and human infections, but also undermine investments in healthcare and environmental systems around the world. But already we're seeing purchasing habits trend towards sustainably farmed livestock, carrying short-term increased production costs for businesses. So we've got to think long-term. We know that reducing antibiotic use will lead to resilient supply chains and secure long-term financial returns. But as we've seen, COVID-19 has upturned the meaning of business as usual. It's also an opportunity, though, to rethink what we're doing and change our business practices for the better and for the future. We can and we must build back better, as the Secretary General asks us to do. Through our infrastructure and behaviour, we've got an opportunity to protect our shared environment while improving productivity too. We can be prepared for the future, but actually, we can shape a better future. We can be proactive. And just as AMR poses a risk to investments, investment decisions made through an AMR lens, thinking about the impact on infections and the response, will generate value for companies and their assets. And on that, I want to congratulate FAIRR for setting up the AMR Action Fund. That's really a great step in the right direction. But this AMR lens is why earlier this year, we from the UK government, in collaboration with FAIRR, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment and Access to Medicines Foundation, launched the Investor Action on AMR initiative during the World Economic Forum in Davos. We didn't know early January where we'd be now. We called on investors to commit to making sustainable investments. Our objective is to align the behaviour of investors and the broader financial community to international standards, goals, and guidelines. After all, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals depend on a sustained One Health response. So to be leveraging the influence that investors have and integrating AMR into the way investors use their influence is important to deliver change. Last year, I finished co-convening the UN Interagency Coordination Group on AMR, the IACG. Our final recommendations were clear. There is a need that is clear to all for investing for a sustainable response to protect investments from the impact of AMR. When investing, private investors with clear consideration of AMR and One Health impacts can make a difference. And investors need to think how your risk exposure is significantly increased if you don't. There really are clear financial, operational, and reputational risks that can be avoided. Do you know, it's a bit like climate change. They have used ESG to change how companies behave, and that is making a difference. We can do the same using the AMR lens and investment to shift how companies behave. By doing the right thing about public goods, companies reassure investors and shareholders they're investing in sustainable innovations that positively impact our world. By pursuing those positive investment choices in global goods, they will also get the best talent and build loyal customer bases. We want to see AMR in that ESG, the environmental, social, and corporate governance. We want investors to recognize that antibiotics and treatments for infections and preventions, including vaccines, such as those being developed to fight COVID-19, are fundamental to all of our livelihoods and every nation as we know them. It must be clear that it's an economic imperative as well as a moral. That be seen in health. If we can reduce the number of deaths attributable to AMR and infections. You know, like COVID-19, antimicrobial resistance is a pandemic, albeit a silent one. So I shall end with an analogy that I often use. COVID-19 is like dropping a lobster into a pan of boiling water. It knows instantly it's in trouble, and so do we, watching it boil. AMR, on the other hand, is like putting that lobster into a pan of cold water and heating it up slowly. It doesn't recognize it's in trouble until the water starts to boil. By then, of course, we all know it's far too late and the pain is much, much worse. I put it to you that we're currently sitting in a pan of very warm water, but it isn't too late to cool it down and rescue that lobster, rescue our antibiotics, and treat infections effectively. We need everyone's help. We need your help in order to do this, because we can do it. And I think you're going to hear from this panel how we are doing it. So I invite you to join us to replace resistance with economic resilience. Thank you very much, Louise. Back to you.
Am I back? Yes. Okay. Sorry, this technology is quite something. Thank you so much, Sally. That's really a great kickoff. As ever, your enthusiasm shines through, and I think it really helps us bring other people and other sectors on board where they haven't traditionally thought that this was their problem, and indeed they have solutions to bring to bear. And it's really thanks to you that, as well as the other partners, that we've got this investor action off the ground. Initially, it was going to be 12 months of focus. We've gone for a bit longer now because of obviously COVID, and of course the opportunities I think that COVID bring as well as the inconveniences around really focusing the minds. So thank you. I know that you can't stay for questions at the end of the session, but if there's anything that is directed for you, then I can take a note and we can try and get answers to people offline. So thanks, Sally. So we're now going to turn to one of the two forward-leaning investors who have really taken this up, heard the rallying cry. So Catherine McCabe from BMO Global Asset Management. Catherine joined BMO back in 2015 and has been a member of the Responsible Investment team since 2018. And she covers public health issues, focusing on the cross-sector impact of AMR, and screens companies to determine their eligibility for BMO GAM's responsible funds, specialising in the pharmaceutical industry. So Catherine will now introduce us to why AMR matters to BMO GAM and beyond. So Catherine, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Louise, for that introduction. Yes, so I'm a member of the Responsible Investment team at BMOGAM, and AMR is a topic I'm really passionate about, and it's great to have the opportunity to speak on this panel today. So looking at public health as an issue, so under our umbrella of public health at BMOGAM, there are 4 topics we're particularly interested in, and AMR is a top priority. We've decided to ramp up our engagement on this topic because we believe that cross-sector action is urgently needed, and that if AMR continues unchecked, we'll face potentially devastating environmental, social and economic consequences. And when I first started looking at AMR in detail 2 years ago, the facts and estimates on this slide convinced me that AMR really has to be a high priority engagement topic for investors. Of course, AMR is already leading to increased healthcare costs and a growing number of deaths, and could meaningfully impact global GDP and livestock production over the next 30 years. I think Dame Sally Davies is absolutely right to compare the threat posed by AMR with the threat posed by climate change. Both issues have to be addressed by investors in conjunction with governments and a wide range of stakeholders. So looking at the SDGs, I think this is a really helpful universal framework which we can use to explain the multifaceted impact of AMR. From our perspective, the SDGs help us to explain why we are engaging on specific ESG issues. And we want to prioritise engagement on the issues which could be most detrimental to them. We recognise that progress towards the SDGs should support a healthy global economy, which enables business growth. And I think there are 6 SDGs which AMR could jeopardise. SDG 3, good health and well-being, is the most obvious starting point. As Dame Sally said, modern medicine is highly dependent on antibiotics. And if they lose their effectiveness, then we could find ourselves in a world in which we can't effectively treat common bacterial infections. Major operations, including caesareans and hip replacements, become very high risk, and people with weakened immune systems become even more vulnerable. Companies in the healthcare sector would have to fundamentally rethink their business models. Then let's consider the other SDGs on this slide. So treating antibiotic-resistant infections is costly, and the healthcare systems of lower income countries are therefore disproportionately impacted. And antibiotic-resistant infections affect both humans and animals. A decrease in global livestock production would undermine food security. Plus, water can be contaminated by antibiotic residues, exacerbating AMR. And then a lack of food and a lack of clean water lead to premature deaths, as do severe antibiotic-resistant infections. And so, through the lens of SDG 8, key concerns are lower productivity and lower economic growth. Finally, progress towards SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production, is only possible if antibiotics are manufactured responsibly and then treated as a precious resource. And broadly speaking, companies are directly impacted by environmental and social problems, regardless of whether or not they stem from AMR. And on the next slide, I want to highlight the business risks we're currently most concerned about. So for companies involved in food production, manufacturing and retailing, they're having to respond to more stringent regulations aimed at curbing antibiotic use. Growing consumer demand for antibiotic-free meat and alternative protein products, and production losses due to infections in animals becoming more difficult to treat. Then for companies in the pharmaceutical industry, investment in cancer drugs has risen rapidly in recent years. And the key issue here is that cancer patients frequently rely on antibiotics for the prevention and treatment of bacterial infections. If antibiotics lose their effectiveness, the effectiveness of cancer drugs is compromised. It's a vicious cycle. So the risks to companies are clear. They're financial, legislative, operational, and reputational. And companies therefore have to take action. Taking action isn't optional. So how can we as investors really make a difference? Well, we think that constructive dialogue can help. So since the beginning of last year, we've been engaging a range of companies on AMR, seeking to highlight best practices and encourage positive change. We've leveraged the Access to Medicine Foundation's research in our dialogue with pharma companies and FAIRR's research in our dialogue with food companies. For pharma companies, we've focused on the challenges surrounding antibiotic R&D, responsible manufacturing to minimise the environmental impacts of antibiotic manufacturing, and appropriate stewardship to promote the sustainable consumption of antibiotics. We agree with the Access to Medicine Foundation's view of GSK, for example, as a leader on taking action to mitigate AMR, and we're really encouraged by recent progress in the pharma industry. For food companies, we've analysed publicly available antibiotic policies, and in our conversations with companies, we've discussed the importance of, one, animal welfare in reducing antibiotic use in intensive farming, and two, not using antibiotics for growth promotion and disease prevention. One company which surprised me is McDonald's. Its antibiotic policies compare favourably to peers, and it's working on reduction targets underpinned by leading animal welfare practices. I think for me, one key takeaway from our engagement is that we've spoken to recognise AMR as a material business risk, but their actions, and this is especially true for food companies, are on a very wide spectrum. We really need more investors to engage companies on AMR to stress the importance of the issue to companies. And it's great that Matt from Rathbone is on the panel today. And I'll hand over now so that he can explain his work on this issue and the angles he's explored.
Okay. As you said, we are joined by Matt Crossman from Rathbone Investment Management, and Matt is the Stewardship Director at Rathbone, where he is responsible for promoting investor stewardship and enabling clients to express their values through their investments in order to contribute to a more sustainable world. So Matt's going to talk about Rathbone's advocacy and engagement and why investors should care about AMR and how they can do so. So I'm hoping to be able to hand over to Matt. I know you were having sound problems earlier, so
hopefully not anymore.
Great. Over to you then, Matt.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great. Thanks everybody, and thank you to all the speakers before me. I'm joining you from a very wet and rainy Dorset. It's fantastic to be part of this conference, and it has been so educational for me over the last few days to listen into all your discussions and to really be learning. I just want to share a few things that overlap a little bit with what my previous speaker said, but also some perhaps from a slightly different perspective on the same sort of issues. So I want to talk about our approach to engaging on this topic and why we think that more and more engagement on AMR from the investment community is desperately needed, not in spite of, but because of the pandemic that we are experiencing. In general, we are aligned with the framework that my colleague from BMO already outlined. We really think that investors have that crucial and important role in being a trusted friend to business, in representing scientific insight and research of the NGO community back to the corporate world. So I've got 3 points that I'm going to make quickly before we move on to our next speaker. And, you know, because this is the afternoon here in the UK, and I think a lot of us have been on various sessions at this conference over 3-4 days now, I've took the liberty of helping design for you some useful content for your social media channels. So I've got 3 points and 3 tweets. So each one of these is headed by a guaranteed 140 character little short, sharp message. It's hardly going to touch upon Dame Sally's now trending hashtag rescue the lobster, but here goes anyway. So the first tweetable point is this: if you see value in biotech and cancer treatments, you need investments in combating AMR. So at the start of this year at Rathbones, we began, and my team internally at Rathbones began talking and looking at the numbers on an idea of a biotech bubble. So there is and was a great deal of excitement in the investment world around 2 areas in the healthcare investment area, which is biotech and immunology and oncology, and also the area of orthopedic implants, as has been mentioned. So we've got the long-term trend of aging populations with a rising prevalence of chronic conditions, such that industry analysts see the value of immunotherapy and oncology rising to $220 billion by 2024, and the medical implants business growing to $116 billion by 2022. All of these were pre-COVID price assumptions, it must be said. But both of these growth areas that are so exciting for investors in these areas rely on and assume a functioning healthcare system. As Dame Sally said in the past and said today, antibiotics underpin modern medicine. It's as simple as that. So we could potentially see a world in which the UK develops and goes incredibly well and fast towards its goals of developing incredible expertise for medical implants, building on insights in genetics and 3D printing and AI technology to provide all the best, most incredibly tailored medical impacts that modern medicine could imagine. But if you still rely on invasive surgery and you suffer a superbug in recovery, that could bring an end to the whole of that investment opportunity. It's one of the industry's few genuinely high double-digit growth sectors, and it could be undermined by the rise in superbugs. Now, when we first shared this concept of a biotech bubble back in January with a journalist for placing an article, it was fed back to us that the idea of there being a biotech bubble was simply too far-fetched, that such massive transitions in healthcare systems simply don't happen. And I wonder how well that insight has stood up, which brings us to my second point, which is this. So this is your second tweet. Spend a little to save a fortune. The pandemic creates a sober mood where preemptive strikes on healthcare crises are more palatable for action. And we've all seen the numbers, we've heard them quoted a couple of times already today and across different sessions in this work, but the work of Professor Jim O'Neill and the UK AMR review, the numbers on tackling this crisis simply make sense. It is obviously worth it, and from a basic insight, to say that we should spend a little to save a fortune. And forgive me just to digress for a moment, but if healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry isn't the only sector that I focus on, I work on things like climate change and combating modern slavery. And these are genuinely intractable problems, genuinely cross-sectoral with huge diffuse impacts, with no obvious lever to push to solve them, with no obvious solutions for which to pull off the shelf. Not so, I fear, with AMR. We know the kind of things we need to do. We know the level of investment that we need. We know who needs to do what, and we know when they need to do it by to avoid this crisis. And to quote, I wonder if you had a time machine and went back to January 2019 and were able to sit around the table with the G20, say, for example, and share the charts from the economic impacts that we are only just beginning to experience now after the CV-19 pandemic. You know, what would those governments have paid to avoid the situation we now find ourselves in? And there's a really telling quote from the head of the World Health Organization back in 2017. He said, "Antimicrobial resistance will take us back to a time when people feared common infections and risked their lives from minor surgery." Are we in a mood to create investment in healthcare systems again? And if so, if we are, we need to address antimicrobial resistance as a matter of urgency. It just makes sense. We have that fear of common infections again. And dare I say, it could be a silver lining that we create that societal momentum behind increased investment in combating AMR. So just thirdly, and this to round out my contribution, I wonder if there's something to be said about how we further engage the biotech, immunology, and the pharmaceutical industry. And this is your third and final tweet. Combating AMR is about more than protecting the bottom line. It's about articulating your purpose. So I want to perhaps nudge and go beyond this idea of the business case, which I think is absolutely fundamentally true and sound, but into this another important area for UK PLC and for businesses in general, this idea of social purpose. We had the Business Roundtable letter this time last year where the chief executives of hundreds of US companies wrote to national newspapers saying that their overriding purpose was not shareholder value, but creating value wider for communities and their employees. But now that R&D into new antibiotics, it isn't loss-making. It's just not as spectacularly lucrative as some of the areas of pharmaceutical development that we've been used to. Not as lucrative as a new lifestyle drug, for example. But companies and their management, and indeed investors for their part of the equation, are being pushed by society and government to justify their scale and impact. We are being asked to show and demonstrate how we are aligning our investments with the SDGs, as the previous speaker mentioned. Well, I wonder, and I just want to leave you with this question, should investment in combating AMR and in the promotion of antibiotic development be a prerequisite for expectations of good corporate citizenship in the sector? Because when it comes to the burden of disease, we know it's the poorest countries that suffer the most. So I wonder if AMR should become a more fundamental part of efforts on the access to medicines agenda also. We're still debating the best way for governments to incentivize action on promoting antibiotics research and development. And there's been a number of helpful sessions in this particular conference which have talked about new and innovative models. And it's been fantastic to see the recent establishment of the AMR Action Fund, for example. But I wonder for investors if there's one lever that we need to pull, which is to push for executives in the industries that are affected in biotech, immunology, oncology, pharmaceuticals, etc., to link a proportion of their executive pay to effective action on the AMR agenda. And I certainly think that's one lever that investors can be helpful in promoting as we wait around for debates around taxation and other innovative structures to materialize. So those are your 3 points, those are your 3 tweets. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion and see where it goes. And with that, I'll hand back, I believe, back to Louise.
Thank you, Matt. Sorry about that. Trying to get the technology to work. Thank you, and to Catherine as well. I think it's fantastic. We do have investment firms such as the two of yours that really have leaned into this issue. Personally, I think I will be taking away the hashtag Save the Lobster for Twitter, and we will be using that indiscriminately over the next few months. So we'll come back to questions to you and to Catherine at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mara Lilley from Access to Medicines Foundation, and we've heard the foundation being cited the work of the AMR benchmark in really key evidence to be used by investors when they have these sorts of conversations. So Mara is the investor engagement manager for the strategy team at the foundation, and she manages the ongoing conversations with ESG and mainstream investing communities about the foundation's research. So Mara is going to talk about this work and the foundation's AMR benchmark as well. So Mara, over to you.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks to all the speakers beforehand. Yes, I'm the Investor Engagement Manager at the Access to Medicine Foundation. The foundation is a research-based not-for-profit organisation which guides and incentivizes pharmaceutical companies to do more on global health and AMR. We build consensus across multiple stakeholders, including companies, NGOs, academics, and investors, on the actions that society expects pharmaceutical companies to be taking, and then we track progress on this. And we're primarily funded by governments and foundations, so we remain entirely independent from the pharmaceutical industry. So the foundation focuses on AMR, and we're the organisation behind the AMR benchmark. The 2020 benchmark was launched in January this year, and it's the first and only independent report to compare what a cross-section of pharma companies are doing to bring AMR under control. And the methodology behind the benchmark represents the views of over 100 different experts and stakeholders. And the benchmark itself evaluates 30 companies with a key stake in the anti-infectives market on where they have the most potential to limit AMR. So that includes a range of multinational pharma companies, generics medicines manufacturers, and biotech firms. So at a glance, the benchmark findings are provided within 3 research areas, the first of those being research and development, the second being responsible manufacturing, and the third being ensuring appropriate access and stewardship around antibiotics. And these are then broken down into 19 different indicators, which you can see on the PowerPoint slides. 4 key findings and 12 best practices are reported within the 2020 benchmark, and each company receives a detailed report card which covers company-specific performance. And all of this is on our website, and you can download report cards for companies individually, as well as best practice examples and the key findings. So we work very closely with a whole range of investors, so over 100 different asset owners and asset managers across the globe, to better understand and engage with the risks and opportunities of access-related issues. So we support investors to use our reports, scorings, and indicators in their investment processes, and our reports also provide a useful framework for investors' direct engagement with investee companies on access to medicine and AMR issues. And just to give a bit more of an example of how we work with investors, some look to integrate our report scoring into their stock valuation models, some come to the foundation for more detailed analysis of a particular company or sector trends, and others use our indicators to help identify either red flags or positive signals, which can then be integrated into their own analysis of the pharma and biotech sector. We're also one of the partners in Maria will be talking more about that in a minute. At the macro level, the social and economic costs of AMR are significant, and it's an issue set to impact anyone who's invested in the global economy. I think Matt and Catherine have already done a very good job of outlining the key risks and opportunities, so I'll avoid repeating what's already been said. I just add an additional point for the pharmaceutical sector in particular, in addition to the impact which a lack of effective and accessible antibiotics will have on more profitable business lines. Antimicrobial manufacturing discharge also presents a key supply chain issue, with new regulations on the horizon, green procurement on the rise, and increasing attention from civil society. However, there are opportunities that can be seized in best practice and through the new and developing range of push and pull incentives which are arising for the sector. And with these risks and opportunities in mind, the 2020 AMR benchmark found positive signs of progress and momentum, including improvements in the implementation of responsible sales practices and through the public sharing of AMR surveillance results to reduce the spread of resistance. However, the benchmark found that progress isn't yet matching the scale of the challenge, and we really need to see companies investing and developing new antibiotics, making them accessible to those who need them, and ensuring that they are produced and promoted responsibly. And so to conclude, the AMR benchmark provides a good framework for investors who are wishing to take a more active role in this topic and engaging companies further, especially as part of the Investor Action on AMR initiative. Thanks.
Get the hang of this by the end of the session. Thank you so much, Mara. We'll move swiftly on to Maria so that we've got enough time for questions at the end. But that was a really great overview of the work of the foundation and the benchmark, which certainly we as policymakers find incredibly useful and will continue to do so. So handing over now to Maria Lettini of the FAIRR initiative. So Maria is the Executive Director of FAIRR, which is the institutional investor network focused on material, financial, environmental and social risks, that's a mouthful, associated with intensive livestock production and the opportunities in plant-based protein. Prior to this, Maria had an extensive career in sustainability and finance, working with investors while at the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment, which is also a partner in the Investor Action on initiative, as well as JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. So Maria will talk to us about how we can drive change in the animal health industry. So over to you, Maria.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Louise. And again, thank you, Biocom, for this absolutely fascinating and enlightening conference today. Again, my name is Maria Lettini. I'm the Executive Director of the FAIRR Initiative. We are an institutional investor network. Again, we have over 250 members whose combined assets total over $23 trillion. Now, just as a technical, thank you. I was going to say, cannot yet see my slides, and I'll move right on. I'm assuming those will move in a second. So we have global institutional investors that are members of our network. And really our aim is to produce research and practical tools for those investors to really understand the risks associated with intensive animal production and the opportunities with a transition to other sustainable alternative proteins. We've been around since December 2015, and our range of issues covers all of the ESG issues, but one of our flagship pieces of work is AMR. And we work across the value chain and how animal protein touches on a variety of different financial sectors. So you can see we do obviously think about the pharma sector and how antibiotics are used in the production system. We engage with food producers. We look at the manufacturers, retailers, and restaurant chains all the way through to sort of all of the consumer-facing side. We currently cover 107 companies. That number is increasing every year as we incorporate more companies into our coverage universe. And so one of the reasons that we FAIRR are here today is, as I mentioned, one of our flagship issues since we started the initiative back in 2015 has been overuse of antibiotics in the livestock supply chain. Now, when we started talking about this issue back in 2015, and knowledge about it obviously has grown in the investor community, but many investors really didn't understand the overuse of antibiotics in the food system at all. And so when we put together this particular collaborative engagement, we focused on the consumer-facing companies. We asked them, along with a coalition of institutional investors, to, over a 3-year period, begin to reduce the use of medically important antibiotics in their animal supply chains across all of their jurisdictions and across all of their proteins. So a huge ask. And we wanted to see actionable policies that were made publicly available. And that 3-year initiative was actually really, really successful. And it's one of the things that really put AMR on the map in the investor space. And we saw real meaningful policies from pretty much all these names here that you see on this slide. Now, when that engagement came to a close at the end of 2019, the idea was to go back and just follow progress from these companies. They knew what was expected from the investor coalition. They saw some best practice studies, and obviously Catherine mentioned the progress of McDonald's. But a lot of the progress that we had seen, now that the actual year-on-year investor engagement had tapered off, also saw a tapering off of progress. And so really, it really points to the fact that from 2020 onward, we really need to get some investor re-engagement on this issue. We need to let not only these consumer-facing companies know that this still is a significant financial risk to the long-term performance of financial portfolios and to their own profitabilities, but we want to make sure that there's significant policies in place across the entire value chain. And so for us, we have, and other organizations as well that are in other advocacy organizations, have been looking at the consumer-facing companies, and now we think it's also time to start looking at the animal health industry. We see this as the stars, a little sweet spot in the convergence circles here, with what's happening on the production side, what needs to be happening on the R&D side, and what's happening on marketing and distribution. And we want to be engaging across the chain to really understand how this sector works, right? And from a FAIRR perspective, we want to see a lot of what we've learned from the human health commitment side and the pharma side really begin to translate into animal health, including things like production of new antibiotics, production and use and marketing of alternatives, tracking and tracing of residues, come into play here. All things which we know the investment community is relatively familiar with from antibiotics use on the human health side, largely in part with a lot of the work that our partners Access to Medicine has been doing. And so in order to really get a broad understanding of what's happening in the animal health sector, we're embarking on a pioneering piece of research for investors on the animal health sector. And really the aim here is to try and tease out what are some of the really important lever points for investors. What are the questions and areas that investors really need to be probing with these animal health companies in order to start to see significant progress and change, and be able to identify best practice within animal health companies and see some relative and comparative advantages across this sector. And that leads us to obviously this very important initiative that we have been working on with our partners, the Access to Medicine Foundation, PRI, and obviously the UK government. Anyway, which is the investor action on AMR initiative. I'm sure perhaps Louise will talk a little bit more about it, but we're very excited about this initiative. We understand that this is a coalition of not only investors, but investor engagement across stakeholders, as both Dame Sally mentioned and Mara. And the idea is for investors to commit to challenges and actual actions to help drive progress on AMR. So, I mean, being an investor doesn't automatically mean an injection of capital, right? It means using influence to engage across a variety of different actors in the value chain. So in dialogues with policymakers and legislators, as we've mentioned, credit rating agencies, we can talk about producing new financial products, and all of which can help support this idea of transitioning away from the use of antibiotics, in many cases, particularly on the animal health side, to different alternatives and different methods to keep animal health in the forefront. So we'll talk more about the investor action from AMR, presumably through questions of my fellow panelists, but we're very excited today to bring this to the attention, and we look forward to further announcements during Antibiotics Awareness Week in November.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria, very much. And yeah, this has been a fantastic project to work on with the organisations that you listed, and also with some of those really forward-thinking investors. And I'm hoping that we can really finish off the year with a bit of a bang. And let's see. Watch this space. I know that certainly you and the Access to Medicine Foundation have been working hard behind the scenes, so looking forward to being able to go a bit more public with that. So we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to move to questions very quickly. First of all, we've got one from Matt, which I think you were able to see in the knot, from Mark Gitzinger, on wanting to contradict your statement around the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. So Mark says, as of today, AMR products are loss-making and not at all profitable. In this space, it is not about coming back to huge revenues, it is about coming back to revenues at all. So I wondered if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that has been the received wisdom for a number of years. And it was certainly a line that I used myself for a long time. But the more you talk to companies in the area, there seem to be isolated examples of very well produced, researched and targeted products which clearly had a market, but just weren't receiving the support they required from big pharma. So I appreciate that at a blanket level, there are incredible issues with the broker market around the incentives for AMR products, but there are certainly specific examples on niche products perhaps, or those which are particularly innovative, which could deliver a very low level of growth, which would clearly have a benefit. So I do have a couple of examples which perhaps we could share where there was clearly a market and a clear revenue stream, but yet the incentives did not deliver to bring those companies out of their initial phase. So yeah, I just think it's challenging that wisdom. We're used to returns in the sector in double digits, but we're not going to get that from something that's been a victim of its own success, like antibiotics, for example. So yeah, it wasn't to make a statement that all AMR products are profitable and we all just need to get over it. It's to push back and challenge the accepted wisdom, which is often used as an excuse for inaction.
Yeah, I would agree, and not that I am really in the detail like you are, but certainly, I mean, my personal view is around whether this needs to be seen as more of a loss leader as well. I mean, we've talked about it with pharma colleagues before. In order to shore up their longer term returns from their oncology portfolios, they will need to have sustainable anti-infective portfolios, and we can't expect to see the sorts of revenue generation from this category of product. So I think we kind of need to accept that and find creative solutions to make sure that revenue is generated where possible. And then there's the other idea of the fact that we're not really necessarily working to the markets, the non-traditional markets or the far merging markets where the burden of disease is highest. So I don't know if either of you have got anything to contribute on that point where our focus tends to be on those North American, European and Asia Pacific markets. But what about those far emerging countries, which are generally speaking those sort of upper middle income countries like India, South Africa, China, to a certain extent, Russia, etc.? Catherine, have you got any thoughts on that as to where you see your investment portfolio going in that space?
Yeah, so I'm sure Mara can chip in on this as well. But what I would say on this topic is that, you're absolutely right. The focus does tend to be on what happens in the US and then in Europe. And obviously, the healthcare systems of lower income countries would really struggle if we were to end up in a situation where you've got increasingly resistant antibiotic bacterial infections, which are then far more costly to treat. And for that reason, I mean, the Access to Medicine Foundation has actually been looking at how pharmaceutical companies approach access to antibiotics in emerging markets, because obviously you want the message of stewardship there to be as strong as in developed markets. And one area we've been looking at is how pharma companies actually adapt their packaging. So you can even have pictograms, for example, in packaging to show people what responsible use looks like. And publishing information in lots of different languages, for example, make sure that the information is shared with as wide an audience as possible.
Takes me back to one of the earlier sessions in the week, which was fascinating kind of talk on those the more kind of societal issues and how you make sure that consumers understand, and that's not always obvious. One of my team is Mongolian, and she was saying how all of the drugs in Mongolia, their instructions are still in Russian. And yet, if you're in Mongolia after sort of 1991, you don't speak Russian. So you go to the pharmacy, you pick up a product, and you have no idea how to use it. And I guess it's details like that that we don't necessarily think about that are really important to shine a light on. So another question for you, Matt, and then make sure that I bring Maria and Mara in. But so Ruth Atkinson says, great intervention, really like the idea of linking proportion of executive pay to action on AMR. Is there a precedent for that, i.e. in climate change or other sectors?
Yeah, a great question as well, and thank you for it. Yes, there is precedent for that. So with another hat on, I work for the represent Rathbones on the Institutional Investors Group on climate change, and I actually co-led with the oil company Shell from 2014 to 2017. And one of the things that we were successful in getting them to think about was to align, I think it's 20% of their executive scorecard and executive pay to a range of ESG metrics. And they've even taken that one step further to align with their clear decarbonisation targets. Sorry, I apologise if you can hear any crazy. It's actually thundering and lightning outside of me. I think a certain drama to my interventions today. I do apologise. The other area we've seen is with a company SSE PLC here in the UK, where we've just got them to agree a proportion of their annual bonus every year to progress on their decarbonisation targets. It's something you can use as a means to say, you know, one area in corporate governance is to get people to build up their own shareholdings. It's a basic statement, isn't it, that we do what we're incentivized to do. Now, you have to have a certain willingness or a certain maturity, I guess, in terms of the remuneration committee's approach to make sure it's just not a box ticking thing, which is easy to achieve. If it's something that's subjectively assessed by the boards of pharmaceutical companies, then it won't have an effective delivery. But if it's something that's woven through the whole of their executive pay scorecard, set around medium and long-term targets, it has been shown to be effective in driving corporate change in response to global emerging trends. So it's something that I would be, interested to explore with other investors to try and see if there's any exemplar companies we could work on to build AMR awareness into the executive pay scorecard.
On AMR initiative, so we might well be coming back to you and taking you up on that. So we've got a question from Ed Sigwart, who asks, or who I think rightly points out that previous discussions, it's been widely agreed that responsibility for fixing this problem, fixing the antimicrobial market failure, really rested solely with governments. What role can investors play, and is that responsibility actually a shared one? I mean, I think we've heard about the role of investors playing here, but Mara, your thoughts on the idea of an us and them, and whether it's a government problem or it's an industry problem or it's a shared one. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I definitely think it's a shared problem, but I mean, it's definitely something that the government has a responsibility to respond to. I mean, investors need to be ahead of this anyway, right? Governments will have to act. This is, as we are, as everyone has already said, this will come at a significant financial cost to healthcare systems, and we know now to broader economies. And investors will need to get ahead of those, upcoming regulations. And we've already seen regulation in Europe. There will be regulation, I believe, rolled out more globally over time. And that will absolutely affect the financial performance of their portfolios. And so it's working together to have these dialogues across stakeholders, not only government, to understand what's at stake, because certainly the capital markets is going to play a critical role in, you know, supporting governments and delivering on the SDGs. So they definitely need to be part of this discussion.
Mara, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would second everything that Maria has said there. I think this is such a global systemic issue that all players are needed if we really want to tackle this challenge. And as the benchmark findings have shown, particularly in the pharma sector, we're seeing progress, but we need to see more. So I think, yeah, investors really can be key change makers in encouraging and incentivizing company progress. And I think the Investor Action on AMR initiative kind of sets the scene for what investors can really do in this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really key that we move away from this sort of zero-sum issue where all sides look to others and saying, actually, in the longer term, it's your problem. I think it's very much a shared problem, and therefore we need shared solutions. And I think just sort of seeing or hearing some of the dialogue around the AMR Action Fund being very much a sort of a stopgap, I think it's absolutely vital that we do look at that wider ecosystem. But we'll all need to kind of pull together to make that happen. I think it can't just be a government-led or regulatory-led change. I'm just aware that we are now at 3:15. We've got questions still coming through, but we only had the hour, which is a bit of a shame because I know that some of the other sessions were a bit longer. But I'd just like to thank the panel for their really insightful presentations, very helpful Twitter hashtags and taglines, some really crunchy metrics there, and a great range of action that's going on in an area that you wouldn't instinctively think actually plays a role, but I think increasingly needs to be not just playing the role, but it's being seen to play a role. So if I could encourage anybody who's asked questions that we haven't covered, if you'd like to go and meet the speakers in the virtual coffee rooms, then please do. And thank you ever so much. And hashtag save that lobster. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Louise.
Thank you.